In this video I'm going to raise a question about Romeo and ask whether or not it's possible for the audience to be genuinely sympathetic towards him as a tragic hero. And to set this up, I want to return to the original concept of the tragic hero as defined by Aristotle in the 4th century BC. Aristotle said a lot about tragedy, and one of the most important concepts that he came up with was this notion of hamartia, or flaw. Now, in a modern context, we tend to regard that as meaning a character flaw, a fault in that person's personality or psychology. But that wasn't necessarily how Aristotle was defining it way back then. He said that a tragic hero is a man who is not eminently good and just, yet whose misfortune is brought about not by vice or depravity, but by some error or frailty. And it's that idea of error or frailty or weakness that gives us the definition of hamartia. It can be a mistake. It can come from missing information. It doesn't necessarily have to relate to a character's own personality. And if you look at Romeo and Juliet, you'll see that a lot of the tragedy does come about through mistakes characters make because of flaws in their own character, but also a lot of the plot happens because of completely innocent mistakes and misunderstandings and chance meetings and cross purposes. And this brings us to this question of how responsible Romeo really is for what happens and the consequences of what he does. Very often there's an ambiguity in tragedy, in that you get characters who have great flaws in their characters, but at the same time there's also a sense that there's some hand of destiny, some invisible cosmic force that's out of anyone's control that's pushing them forward to this tragic conclusion. Romeo himself very explicitly frames his life in terms of fate and destiny. He talks about some consequence yet hanging in the stars, as if to imply that his life and his actions and the consequences that will result from his actions are somehow guided by some external cosmic force that he's not necessarily responsible for. At the other end of the play, when Friar Lawrence is summing up the tragedy, he credits events to the divine, implying that Romeo never really had much of a choice. And if you just look at the structure of the play, you'll see that the situations Romeo finds himself in are very often down to pure coincidence. He doesn't intend to avoid the fight at the beginning of the play. He doesn't intend to meet Juliet. He doesn't intend to run into Tybalt in that fateful scene in the middle of the play. So in that regard, the importance of fate and destiny emerges quite naturally. But there's another element that we need to bear in mind, which is that it's not just where Romeo finds himself that matters, or whether he's put himself in those situations, but it's what he does then that matters. It's how he responds to the situations he's in. Because it might be that he doesn't intend to get into a fight, but then the question becomes, well, once he is in the fight, what does he do? And this leads us to the question of what his main character flaw really is, his hamartia. And perhaps the most glaring candidate for this is his impulsiveness, his tendency to behave rashly without really thinking through the consequences of his actions. It's worth pointing out that his impulsiveness very rarely leads to violence. It only really leads to violence once, the death of Tybalt, and in that situation we might say he's facing extreme provocation. But Romeo is a character of extremes. He tends to react very, very emotionally and very, very strongly and very, very quickly. And it's that strong emotional reaction that causes him to isolate himself at the beginning of the play and consequently miss the fight in Act 1, Scene 1. So even though he ends up killing Tybalt through his impulsiveness also spares him a fight somewhere else in the play. So it's a little bit difficult to say well, yes, he's impulsive, this causes violence. It's not quite that simple. But what really does matter is that other characters in the play recognise his flaw. They recognise his impulsiveness, they point it out, and they express concern about it. They fear what might come of it. So very early in the play, in the balcony scene, Juliet, who has only met Romeo that night, comments on how suddenly he seems to have fallen in love. And she expresses a certain scepticism about whether or not love that has emerged so quickly can really be real. And I think the reason this is significant is partly because Juliet in general doesn't have a great deal of agency in the play. She is a mostly reactive character, and so for her to demonstrate a level of insight into another character is really the only power she's given in the play. But there's also the fact that it happens early. Romeo's flaw is recognised by other characters before Romeo recognises it himself. And I think it's interesting to put two contrasting judgments about Romeo side by side. Capulet sings Romeo's praises to Tybalt, although it should probably be noted that Capulet is really out to stop a fight in his house, so in that regard he's perhaps got an ulterior motive. The nurse, meanwhile, follows up Juliet's own suspicions and warns Romeo not to lead her into a fool's paradise. So there is a sense that the characters of this play recognise Romeo for what he is. But for a tragedy to really be a tragedy, there has to be this concept of anagnoriasis, the transition from ignorance to awareness. A character who is oblivious to their own flaw or their own error becomes aware of it over the course of the tragedy. And if we look at that fateful scene, Act 3, Scene 1, Romeo's immediate reaction to the killing of Tybalt is, "Oh, I am Fortune's fool." So he's realised the depth of his tragedy at the exact moment that it becomes too late to do anything about it. But he returns to this concept of fortune and destiny. He calls himself the plaything of chance and fate and destiny. Now this does seem to be consistent with his previous statements, and I question what this means for Romeo's concept of personal responsibility. Is he trying to avoid it, or is he just pointing out a kind of cosmic irony? Now it's worth returning here to the chorus, which provides the prologue of the play, and it does seem to endorse Romeo's idea that fate is primarily responsible. It talks about star-crossed lovers, for example, which seems to support Romeo's tendency to look outward rather than inward. And the chorus, because it's not really part of the story, because it stands on the stage and looks out at the audience and addresses the audience directly, can be seen to be objective. It's tempting to regard them as an objective observer. And while you certainly can interpret the chorus in that way, it remains up to the audience to decide how much weight to give that point of view. It doesn't necessarily cancel out the other argument that Romeo is responsible for his own mistakes, just because the chorus points out that Romeo and Juliet are star-crossed. That said, the chorus does bring up fate and destiny as a theme of the play. It is part of the text, and so there's an interesting point of ambiguity there that you might like to draw out if you get the opportunity. Now we arrive at the final scene, Act 5, Scene 3, set in the tomb. It's a long scene, and I think it's a scene where we really see every aspect of Romeo's character at once. He comes across as very emotional in this scene, very hysterical. He makes a lot of threats. Some are quite serious to Paris, others to Balthazar seem much more like hyperbole and exaggeration and more like empty threats. But at the same time, there are much quieter moments. There are very tender moments. He tries to reconcile himself with his former enemies. The quotation that I've picked out there is his apology directed at the body of Tybalt. As Paris is dying, his last request is to be buried next to Juliet, and Romeo accepts that request and fulfills the last wishes of a dying man. So there is a sense, I think, that Romeo is trying to atone for his mistakes. The nature of a tragedy is that the mistakes are often too big to really put right, but he does his best to save his soul. So for all that he looks at fate and destiny, he is still a character who accepts his own responsibility for his actions and tries to put them right as best as he can. So, to sum up, it is worth remembering that the original definition of hamartia referred to errors and missing elements, missing information, and the idea that it referred to a specific flaw in a character's personality or psychology is a much more recent way of using that word. And it's often worth thinking about the way either or both definitions can be useful in interpreting a character. In Romeo and Juliet, fate and destiny is explicitly credited by several characters as being a driving force of the story. That's endorsed by a seemingly objective chorus. And don't forget that you can measure a character's flaws not just by what they do, but by how they respond to events, how they react to problems, not merely how they cause them.